Imagine a young nurse walking into the hospital every day with worn-out shoes, a second-hand uniform, and dreams too fragile to share with anyone, while the world around her laughed at her silence. But what if I told you that one night, when she thought her life was crumbling, the father of her patient looked her in the eyes and asked, "Will you be my first date?" What happened next changed everything forever. This is not just a story. It's a journey of heartbreak, secrets, and miracles you'll never forget. And before we begin, make sure to subscribe right now, because stories like these are rare, emotional, and powerful, just like you. Now, let's begin. There was once a young nurse named Emily who lived in a small rented apartment on the edge of the city, where the lights of wealth and glamour barely reached her window, and every morning she would wake up before dawn, tie her tired hair into a neat bun, and slip into the same faded blue scrubs she had worn for 3 years straight, because she could not afford new ones, and yet she carried herself with grace, as if her uniform were made of silk and diamonds. She walked to the hospital with worn shoes that pinched her feet, and a heart that carried too many burdens but also too many dreams. She had always wanted to be more than a nurse. She wanted to heal the world in ways beyond medicine, but bills, debt, and loneliness kept her chained to survival. Still, she never let her patients see her exhaustion. She smiled at them like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, and they loved her for it. Yet when she went home at night, she stared at her cracked ceiling, wondering if she was invisible to the world and to fate itself. Until one evening, her life shifted forever. It began with the arrival of a new patient, a young boy named Daniel, barely 12 years old, struck by a rare illness that demanded constant care. His father, a tall man with graying temples and eyes that carried storms, moved into the ward, like a shadow, refusing to leave his son's side. And though Emily had seen many fathers worried about their children, something about this man unsettled her, not in fear, but in mystery, as if he carried secrets buried deeper than the hospital walls could hold. The first night she approached him offering warm water, and he looked at her with a flicker of recognition. Though she had never met him before, it was as if he knew her, or wanted to know her, but chose silence instead. Every 2 minutes her heart would catch as she noticed small oddities, like how he never answered phone calls, how he never smiled, how he sometimes stared at her when he thought she wasn't looking, and though her instincts told her to keep her distance, fate kept pulling them together. Daniel adored Emily, clinging to her kindness, laughing at her stories, even when his body was weak, and his father seemed to soften each time he saw his son's joy in her presence. Still, Emily never thought much of it, because she had her own struggles. The hospital staff whispered about an upcoming charity ball, a glamorous night where nurses and doctors were invited to dance among wealthy donors, a night that could open doors for connections and opportunities. But Emily knew she could never go. She had no money for a dress, not even enough for a decent pair of shoes. She smiled whenever her colleagues asked if she was coming, but inside she felt the sting of exclusion, like a locked door. She had no key to turn, and then one night, as she sat in the empty cafeteria sipping plain tea, the father of her patient suddenly appeared and sat across from her, his eyes scanning her with a calm intensity that made her breath falter. He said softly, "You care for my son, as if he were your own." And she replied, "Every child deserves to feel safe when they're sick." And for the first time, he smiled, not a broad one, but enough to make her heart stumble. Yet what followed next twisted her world. He asked, "Are you going to the charity ball?" And she laughed bitterly, saying, "No, I don't own a dress." And his silence lingered like thunder before rain, until he finally whispered, "Would you go if I asked you to as my first date?" And in that moment, Emily's entire life tilted. The poor nurse who could not even buy a dress was being asked by a wealthy, mysterious father to be his date. And she felt torn between disbelief and temptation, because deep down she feared it was a cruel joke. But something in his eyes told her it was real. But before she could answer, The overhead alarms rang. Daniel's condition dropped. Suddenly doctors rushed in, and Emily sprinted beside them, panic in her chest as the boy who had given her joy now struggled for life. Every second counted, and the father stood frozen, his fists trembling, as Emily shouted instructions, her voice stronger than she thought possible, and somehow, through skill, through desperation, through love, Daniel's condition stabilized, and when it was over, Emily collapsed against the wall, tears streaking her face, and the father approached her, whispering, "Thank you." But before she could catch her breath, he said again, "Emily, I'm asking you please be my first date." His voice cracked, not like a man of power, but like a man afraid to lose more than he already had, and Emily's heart thundered, yet she knew saying yes would change everything, and saying no would haunt her forever. And as she stood there in that cold, sterile hallway, with the smell of antiseptic and the echoes of life and death around her, the suspense of her choice hung heavier than any night she had ever lived. Emily could not sleep that night. Her mind kept circling around the question that had been left hanging in the sterile hallway of the hospital, a question that did not belong in her world of syringes and worn shoes and lonely dinners, but in another, brighter universe where women wore gowns and men asked them to dance. "Would you be my first date?" Those words echoed in her bones, and she wondered if perhaps she had imagined them. Perhaps exhaustion had twisted her ears, but no. His eyes had been too steady, too desperate for it to be a mistake, and so she lay awake until dawn, staring at the faded cracks in her ceiling, torn between laughter at the absurdity and fear at the possibility. By morning, she decided to bury the thought she had patience, to care for lives to hold together, and she had no time for dreams. But when she entered Daniel's room, the boy grinned weakly and whispered, "Dad said, you're coming to the ball." And Emily froze, her heart lurching, because children never lie about such things. She glanced at the father, who sat silently by the bed, his hands folded as though waiting for her answer. She stammered, "I don't have a dress," and he replied without hesitation, "Then you will, because I will make sure of it," and the conviction in his tone felt like lightning splitting her ordinary world. Yet still she resisted, saying, "You don't know me." And he said, "Maybe that's the point. Maybe I need to know you, and maybe you need to know yourself." And the weight of his words hung heavier than the machines beeping in the background, and once again she felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Still, she tried to resist. She worked double shifts to distract herself, but each time she passed Daniel's room, she felt his father's gaze like a question she could not escape, until one evening as she was leaving the hospital, rain pouring down like punishment, she found him waiting by the exit, holding a plain brown box. He handed it to her without a word and walked away, leaving her shivering in the storm. She opened it later in her apartment and gasped, because inside lay a dress, simple yet breathtaking, deep blue silk that shimmered under her cheap light bulb. She pressed it against her chest, tears burning her eyes because no one had ever given her something so beautiful. But then dread seeped in. What did it mean? What would people think? Was she walking into a trap? But as she struggled with these thoughts, her phone buzzed a message from a blocked number saying, "Sometimes fate dresses you before you can argue." And her heart pounded with both fear and hope. She wanted to run, but something in her soul whispered, "Stay and see." 2 nights later, the charity ball arrived, and Emily stood in front of the cracked mirror of her apartment, trembling in the dress that fit as if it had been made for her. She let her hair down for the first time in years, and for a moment she did not see the poor nurse, but a woman who had been hidden beneath sorrow and duty. She arrived at the grand hall where chandeliers dripped with light and violins filled the air, and instantly she felt every eye turn toward her, whispers rising like smoke. Who is she? Where did she come from? And in that moment she wanted to shrink, but then she saw him, Daniel's father, waiting near the entrance in a black suit that made his graying temples look like silver crowns. and when his eyes met hers, they softened into something almost boyish. He offered his arm, and she hesitated before slipping hers into his, and the hall seemed to hush as though the world itself paused to watch, and for the first time in her life, Emily felt like she belonged somewhere beyond survival. They danced, though she had never been trained, and he guided her with patience, his touch firm yet gentle, and for a fleeting hour she forgot poverty, she forgot loneliness, she forgot even the hospital. But then, as the clock struck 10, the music shifted, the lights flickered, and a figure entered the hall. A woman tall, elegant, with sharp eyes that cut like blades, and she walked straight toward them. The crowd parted, whispers intensifying, and Emily felt her stomach twist because the woman looked at her with disdain, then turned to Daniel's father and said so. "This is the nurse you replaced me with." And Emily realized with horror that this was no stranger. This was his estranged wife, the woman who had abandoned him and Daniel years ago, and now she was back to reclaim what she had left behind, the suspense. It cracked like thunder as the father tightened his grip on Emily's hand, his jaw clenching as he whispered, "Not now, not here," but the woman smirked and said, "The court will know about this," and Emily's world threatened to collapse. She had stepped into a storm she did not understand. But even as fear gripped her, she stood tall, because for the first time she realized this was bigger than a dress. This was about love, about dignity, about secrets long buried. And before the night ended, she knew her choice to stay or walk away would decide not just her future, but Daniel's too. And as the violins played louder, drowning out the whispers, Emily felt the battle lines being drawn around her, and understood that her life would never again be simple or safe. The days after the ball were nothing short of a storm. Emily returned to the hospital, hoping to hide again in her routine of medicine and bandages, but whispers followed her down every corridor. Colleagues who once pitied her now eyed her with curiosity and jealousy. Some even muttered that she was foolish for thinking a man of such wealth and mystery could truly care for a poor nurse. Yet the louder the voices grew, the more Daniel's father seemed to silence them, simply by standing at her side. His name, she finally learned, was Alexander, but he insisted she call him Alex, though everyone else spoke of him with reverence, as a businessman with power enough to bend the city's will. Still, Emily could not reconcile the image of a ruthless tycoon with the man who held his sick son's hand all night, or the man who had offered her address instead of pity. Every 2 minutes a new uncertainty clawed at her heart. Why her? Why now? What did he truly want? And most of all, what would his estranged wife do with the threat she had flung like poison at the ball? Emily soon learned, for the woman whose name was Victoria filed papers demanding custody of Daniel, claiming Alex was unfit to raise him alone, and Emily found herself thrust into a battle. She had no armor for one night. She overheard Alex arguing on the phone, his voice breaking with rage as he said, "She abandoned us, and now she thinks she can buy him back." And Emily realized this was not just a fight about love, but about a child's entire future. She tried to step back, telling Alex she did not belong in his world, but Daniel clung to her, whispering, "Don't leave me. You're the only one who makes me laugh." And her heart shattered because she knew she could not walk away, not when a boy's happiness was at stake. And so she stood beside Alex through hearings, through late nights of strategizing, through cruel headlines that painted her as a gold digger, until one evening as she walked home alone, footsteps followed her into the dark. An envelope was slipped into her pocket, and when she opened it later, her blood ran cold. Inside was a photo of her holding Alex's arm at the ball, with words scrawled across it, "Stay away, or you'll regret it." The threat was clear. Victoria was not fighting clean. She was ready to destroy anyone in her path. Emily burned with fear, but she told no one, for she knew Alex already carried too much. Yet the suspense of every passing day grew unbearable until fate struck. Again, one night, Daniel's condition worsened, his body trembling with fever. his breath shallow, and Emily spent hours at his side until dawn, praying, whispering stories, stroking his hair, until finally he stabilized, and when Alex found her still, there exhausted but unbroken, he knelt beside her and whispered, "I don't know what I did to deserve you, but if I lose you, I lose myself." Emily's tears spilled, but before she could speak, alarms rang, chaos erupted, and a fire broke out in another wing of the hospital, smoke filling the halls, staff and patients running in terror. And as she helped wheel children to safety, a sudden crash shook the building, debris falling near her until strong arms pulled her back. It was Alex shielding her, with his body as flames roared too close. And in that instant she knew the truth. This was not about dresses or dates. This was about survival, about destiny, about love forged in crisis. When they finally emerged into the night air, Daniel safe in his father's arms, reporters swarmed, snapping photos, shouting questions, and one called out, "Alex, is it true this nurse is the reason you're fighting your wife in court?" And Alex turned his head, eyes blazing, and declared loud enough for the world to hear, "She is the reason I'm fighting for everything." And Emily froze, because those words stripped her bare. They made her both a target and a beacon, but they were true, and in that truth she found her strength. Yet the battle was not over. Weeks of court hearings followed, Victoria's lawyers tearing at Alex's reputation, accusing him of recklessness, and at Emily's character, painting her as a manipulative outsider. But each time they tried to break her, she remembered Daniel's laughter, Alex's eyes, the fire that almost claimed them, and she stood unbroken until the final day when the judge delivered his verdict, custody granted solely to Alex. And Victoria's fury cracked like glass shattering across the courtroom. Emily thought it was the end, but as she walked outside with Alex and Daniel, a black car screeched to a halt. Men in dark suits stepping out, chaos exploding in the street, and for a terrifying moment, Emily thought Victoria had sent them. But then Alex whispered, "No, not her," and revealed the truth that sent her world spinning. These were not lawyers. These were men from his past, because Alex had not always been a businessman. He had once been tangled in dangerous dealings, debts and promises made in darker times. And though he had left that life behind, it had not left him. Emily's knees weakened, realizing she had stepped into more than a custody war. She had stepped into a labyrinth of danger. But before fear could consume her, Alex squeezed her hand, whispering, "Trust me," and together they faced the men who demanded payment, a payment Alex refused to give, until one of them turned his gaze on Emily and sneered, "Perhaps she can pay in other ways." And in that instant, Alex lunged, his fist breaking, silenced the fight, raw and violent, until sirens blared, police swarming the scene, and the men fled into the night, leaving scars of a war. Emily never asked to enter, but one she could no longer escape after that. Alex confessed everything, his past, his mistakes, his regrets, and she listened not with judgment, but with the quiet strength of a woman who had known poverty and pain and still chosen compassion. And in that confession they found something rare, honesty in a world built on lies. Weeks turned to months. Daniel slowly recovered. Emily continued her shifts, though now with more respect from colleagues who once whispered, and one evening Alex returned to the same hospital cafeteria where it had all begun, only this time he knelt in front of her, not with a question of a date, but with a ring trembling in his hand, asking, "Will you be not just my first date, but my last, and forever?" And Emily's tears fell like rain as she whispered yes, knowing the journey had been carved in fire and trial, but also in love that refused to die. And so the poor nurse who once could not afford a dress became the woman who taught her father to hope again, a boy to laugh again, and herself to believe that miracles are stitched not from wealth, but from courage and choice. And as their story closed, the world outside still judged, still whispered, but in the hearts of those who listened closely, it became a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can rewrite entire destinies.